Okay, so this lecture is on the endocrine system, and it's also just to get you acquainted with how it's set up in our course for the reading content and the audio-visual content. So if you were to go to modules, let me share my screen. How to do that. Okay. So if you're going to go to modules in our course, and you go down, there's chapter 17, terms and concepts. So that's going to be some of the basic vocabulary and overview of the concepts in the course. And then if we move forward, you'll see that there's textbook, there's the course guide. Remember that that is something that you need to purchase, that the first couple of chapters are going to be provided for you digitally, but I can't do that after chapter 17, so you'll need to get your own. And then we have audio-visual resources. So some of these are going to be from other people that have done a great job of very concise overviews of some of the key concepts. And then I will have a short document overview of the chapter. So if you click on the document, it's actually a link in this case to Google Docs, or you can download the PDF. Go back. And I generated this by trying to go back to the PDF. There we go. I generated this by going into our online text and grabbing some of the vocabulary and some of the chapter review and just putting it in order. So the endocrine system is a system of organs that are distributed throughout the body. They're called glands. Glands are organs that secrete chemicals, and we have two types of glands. Endocrine glands are going to secrete chemicals in the body, so endo within, crine meaning chemical. And so those are going to be into the bloodstream primarily. And then as opposed to exocrine glands, and those would be like sweat glands or even the pancreas when it's secreting digestive enzymes into the intestine. So those internal and the GI tract, that's considered out of the body. So the endocrine system is a system of chemical signaling, and it's a relatively slower system compared to the nervous system, which you learned about in the first semester of anatomy and physiology. So that's really quick. That goes through neurons, and it has a quick initiation and it's quickly ended. The endocrine system takes a longer time, often for the hormones to be synthesized and then distributed to the bloodstream. And then it takes longer compared to the nervous system for them to dissipate. So they have a much longer half-life, especially if they're steroid hormones, which are lipid-based. So that's the endocrine system. So we'll go through the glands as we go through the document. The first one, the adrenal glands, those are probably the most commonly known ones. They're sitting on top of our kidneys, and they produce epinephrine, or also known as adrenaline. So really involved in the fight or flight response. Those chemicals, the hormones are synthesized and then they are dumped into the bloodstream. They rapidly circulate through the body, and any cell that has a receptor for those chemicals, which are called hormones, will receive or lock on the hormone, say epinephrine, will lock onto the receptor, and then it'll initiate a response in the cell. So sometimes these receptors are going to be on the surface of the cell. Those are going to be for hormones that are derived from proteins. They can't go into the cell by diffusing directly through the membrane because they're generally polar or hydrophilic. So they can't go through. The ones that will be able to go through the cell membrane and directly into the cell to find that receptor are going to be ones that are lipid-based. So those are going to be your steroid hormones that are derived from cholesterol. But at any rate, the hormones are circulating through the body, and only those cells that have the receptor are going to have a response to the hormone. And depending on the cell, they might have a varied response. So for, say, adrenaline, if it locks onto a receptor in the muscles and the eye, it will dilate your pupils. If it locks onto a receptor that is in, say, the blood vessels on the surface of the skin, they might constrict so we don't lose blood. In the muscles, it might bring more blood in so that you have more oxygen so you can have that fight or flight response. So for the adrenal glands, they're triangular shaped glands that are sitting on top of the kidneys. The inside is an area that secretes the epinephrine or adrenaline. The outside, or the cortex, that's where you're going to find different hormones being secreted. Those are going to be primarily aldosterone, which is involved in regulating sodium in the blood. Sodium is, remember, a charged ion, and so water is attracted to sodium. So by regulating the ion balance, you can regulate blood pressure. Okay, and there's a lot more information, so I'm going over it really quick, just the overview. So what I put in here, as you go through the document, I actually pulled in the images from the course pack, so it has the histological image, so you can see the outer portion or the cortex, and the inner portion, the medulla of the adrenal glands. And then furthermore, you're going to break that down into different zones, and in those zones you have different hormones that are being released. Okay, so as you go through for this chapter, you want to know the name of the glands, which hormones they produce, and some of the critical anatomy. So the critical anatomy are going to be the cell types that are presented in the course guide and that are also here. So for example, chromatophin, those are the neuroendocrine cells of the inside of the adrenal gland. Okay, so that would be an anatomical piece of the adrenal gland that you'll need to know. So as you go through, read through these, you want to know the names of the hormones. Here's norepinephrine, here's glucocorticoids, aldosterone, cortisol. Cortisol is probably one you've heard of as well. It's often involved in the stress response. And so catabolism of glycogen, downregulation of the immune system. So if you're stressed out, you're going to, remember, anabolism is building up, catabolism is breaking down, so you're going to break down your stored reserves of energy. And in animals, we store for the long term in muscles our energy relatively long term for carbohydrates in the form of glycogen. So cortisol is released. Any cells that have stores of those that are activated are going to start breaking those down. Okay, the next is the gonadal hormone. So that's going to be, the gonads refers to the testes or the ovaries, and we're not going to talk much about these here. We'll talk about them more in later chapters, but you do want to be familiar with the major hormones that are involved in stimulation of testosterone, luteinizing hormone, and follicle stimulating hormone, which is going to produce egg and sperm maturation. So you can see there are histological sections and then a description of some of the hormones of interest. The pancreas is, like I said, has both exocrine, and which is the digestive enzymes that are secreted. That's the exocrine function. And then there's other cells in that same organ, the pancreas, that are involved in synthesizing and secreting hormones into the bloodstream, and those are going to be things like insulin and glucagon. So the pancreas, there are many different cells in there, the alpha cells, beta cells, and delta cells that you need to know. So the alpha cells, they produce glucagon, and the beta cells produce insulin. So insulin is, if you say eat a meal that's really sugary, you have high sugar in your bloodstream, pancreas will respond by secreting insulin. That tells the cells to bring in the sugar from the bloodstream. The opposite of that is going to be a glucagon in response to low sugar in the bloodstream. It'll stimulate, again, catabolism of glycogen, we need energy, so they'll start breaking down energy stores. The parathyroid glands, so those are, para is just adjacent to or next to, so it's next to the thyroid. And this is really involved in calcium. So for the parathyroid, it secretes parathyroid hormone, or PTH, and PTH is going to increase the calcium levels in the blood. So this is really important because calcium is involved in a lot of different physiological reactions. So again, image, there you go. Pineal gland, there's not much on this one. The pineal gland is a small gland in the brain. It responds to light, and it is involved with drowsiness. So changes in light is really responsible for jet lag, changes in your circadian rhythms. Produces melatonin, which you've probably heard about, which is involved in drowsiness. So the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. So this one is this is pretty complex. So the image here, so the hypothalamus is, let me try to blow that up a little bit more. So the hypothalamus is superior to the anterior and the posterior pituitary. And it's involved in actually synthesizing a lot of hormones that our textbook doesn't really go into. So it's highly involved in homeostasis of the body, especially in terms of metabolism, but really in terms of all of the endocrine system. And so it responds to many different signals from the brain and produces stimulating hormones. So the hormones are things like corticotropin releasing hormone, growth hormone releasing hormone, gonadotropin releasing hormone. So these are hormones that are going to be released, and then they will target other cells in other glands and cause them to release hormones. So it's a sequence of events. But we're really not going into that much in this textbook, but I would like you to know that it is responsible for triggering the response of other hormones. You can watch a video there. That's just one from the book that I wanted to emphasize. It's good for you to watch. And then there is this diagram in the book, and it shows the hormones. So this left-hand column here is showing the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus. So on the bottom here, these are all these releasing hormones. So gonadotropin releasing hormone, and growth hormone releasing hormone. They're going to act, many of them act on the pituitary. So they go from the hypothalamus to the pituitary. On the top is the posterior pituitary, and the bottom is the anterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus releases these. It's connected to the pituitary. The hormones are secreted into the blood for the anterior pituitary. For the posterior pituitary, they're actually just the neurons release them, and then they're stored there. So then once the target gland receives those hormones, then they will secrete in turn another hormone, which is going to go through the bloodstream and act on a target organ. So let's just go through an example. So for the gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, so gonadotropin, so think about gonads being the testes or the ovaries. Tropin it's going to be acting on those, and the hormone in this case that it's stimulating the release of is LH, or luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is then released from the pituitary, the anterior pituitary, goes through the bloodstream, and then targets reproductive organs. So this is going to target the gonads. So in the female, the ovaries, and in the male, the testes. In both of those, it's going to stimulate the release of sex hormones. So estrogen, progesterone, testosterone, those things. So there's this cascade of events. All right. So pituitary gland, This one has the most hormones of any gland that you're really going to be responsible for knowing. And so we do have the anterior and the posterior, so go over those and make sure that you know the names of those and their target organs. For the thymus, we're not really talking much about the thymus. It's an organ that is very large in infancy, and then it decreases in size. It's really responsible for development of T cells, which are, we'll look at a little bit later, involved in the immune system and the lymphatic system. Okay, so the thyroid. The thyroid gland is this butterfly-shaped gland in, what do we say here? In the neck anterior to the trachea. And then it's basically for metabolism. So you've probably heard, you may have heard, it's pretty common in women to have, say, hyperthyroid or hypothyroid, where you have an overactive or an underactive thyroid, which changes your metabolism. So the thyroid requires the element iodine, and without this, it can't synthesize the hormones involved in this metabolic regulation, which are T3 and T4. And so if don't have that synthesis, basically the precursors build up and you get what's you may have seen as a goiter. This used to be really common, but now salt and many other compounds have iodine in them, and so it's much less of a problem. Oh yes, and then calcitonin. So the parathyroid that we looked at before regulates calcium and one direction, and then the opposite direction is the thyroid. So in the thyroid gland, it decreases blood calcium levels. So it does the opposite of the parathyroid, which is going to increase them. Okay, so hormone signaling, downregulation. So hormones can be it's basically, there's negative feedback in terms of, that's the most common way that hormones are regulated in the body. So a cell, there's some sort of indicator, maybe that there's low sodium in the blood. And then a response is it increases sodium in the blood. Once that happens, the hormone that's the hormone that is stimulating that increase in sodium is going to be more abundant. Once that increases, then there's going to be a counter effect that's going to shut down the sodium in the blood. So that's called negative feedback, and that's the most common method of regulation in the body. So you can up or down regulate. Types of chemical signaling. Autocrine is when a cell secretes a signal that acts on itself. Paracrine is when it secretes a signal that acts on an adjacent or nearby cell. And then hormone signaling has historically been referred to when a cell or a gland secretes a chemical that's going to go through the blood system and act at a distance. Although more and more this term is becoming used for just any chemical messenger in the body. Again, a hormone has to have a hormone receptor for action to take place in the target cell. Once that receptor binds, it's either on the surface for peptide or hormones that are based from amino acids, so proteins, peptides, or in the cell, inside of the cell is where the receptor is going to be if it's a lipid-based hormone, which is a steroid. So those are the first messengers. Once they hit the target, often there is a secondary messengers, and those are chemical compounds that are going to be involved in transferring that signal within the cell. For hormones that are received on the surface, on the membrane, those are going to initiate much larger cascades of phosphorylation inside. So you have the receptor, you have the hormone in the bloodstream, and it's coming in, and then it docks on the surface of the cell. And then inside you have enzymes that are activated and that activate, exponentially more enzymes, and that's a phosphorylation cascade. And so you can have big internal responses. So depending upon if it's epinephrine, right, that's going to bind, then you might have in a cell a signal that's going to cascade and then start breaking down any stored glycogen so that the glucose can be utilized for energy to make ATP. However, the cascade does stop eventually, and this is primarily due to this enzyme phosphodiesterase, or PDE. That's going to degrade one of those secondary messengers. A common secondary messenger is called cyclic AMP, and so that cuts it off. So without continued activation, that cascade will stop. Okay, and then these images here, just from the book, the one on the top, or this one, shows that you have a lipid soluble hormone. So that's just going to go straight out of the bloodstream, diffuse through this extracellular fluid, straight through the plasma membrane, and then into the cytosol. And then it will eventually bounce into a receptor, and that receptor will then guide the hormone and the receptor complex, usually into the nucleus, where it binds to the DNA for transcription, and that usually leads to protein production. So steroids or lipid-soluble hormones usually result in DNA transcription and then translation. The other scenario is where the hormone is water soluble, so it's not, remember, lipid is like a fat, so this is the opposite of fat. Water and fat are those basically the two things that don't mix, the two types of compounds that you'd see with different properties that allow them to either get into the cell or not. So the water soluble hormone is going to bind to a receptor on the surface, activating a response inside of the cell. Some of the secondary messengers include cyclic AMP, which is shown here. You'll have a whole bunch of reactions happening, and then you have the cell response. Just a few more things. I don't want to go too long, so I really am just giving you an overview. Hormone imbalances, if you have a lot of something, you have the hyperthyroidism is going to be where you have a lot of whatever hormone is being secreted by that gland. So in this case, hyperthyroidism, clinically abnormal, elevated level of thyroid hormone in the blood, increases metabolic rate. So sweating, diarrhea. The opposite of that is going to be hypo. So you have less of something. So hypothyroid, you have less of that hormone in the blood, and so you're going to have a low metabolism. You have weight gain and other constipation as opposed to diarrhea. So just the main idea here is if you know the action of the hormones in a gland, then you can sort of just logically think, what would more of this do? So if I had a, say, hyperparathyroid, and we know that parathyroid is going to increase calcium levels, then you know that the hyperparathyroidism is you would have excess calcium levels in the blood. Okay. And then there are many other organs in the body, fat cells, the heart, basically everything. We're finding more and more secretes chemical messengers, but they're not these primary glands that are part of the endocrine system. So as we go through subsequent chapters, we will go into those and we'll talk about some of the hormones or the chemicals that are secreted by each of those organs. But we don't worry about it for this chapter. Okay, all right. So I think that's a fair overview. I'm a little worried that I've oversimplified it. I want you to go in and go through the chapter in more detail, but hopefully you have an idea for that framework. And so then as you go through it, it's like, oh, okay, now I'm just going to go into more of the details. What are the names of the cells involved? Really focusing on memorizing the hormones that are involved, the actions of those hormones. And then if there is one hormone, I think the most complex one is going to be with the that I'd like you to know is with the hypothalamus and the posterior and the anterior pituitary hormones. Right. Okay. So that's it for me for this chapter. Stop recording. Stop recording.